Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St Hilda's Answer to Gardener's Question Time, which will be very like the original, except with less warning of some of the questions and without the sexist jokes. My name is Nicolette Jones. I'm a St Hilda's graduate and a writer, but also co-founder of my local award-winning community gardening project. And I'm delighted to introduce our green-fingered panel. Serena Cowdy in the blue read history at St Hilda's and has been a journalist specialising in politics and the environment, and worked for wildlife and conservation charities, including the Jane Goodall Institute. She founded and now runs a social enterprise in Scotland called Seeds of Hope, which promotes gardening in the community. She has an allotment and a small orchard. Dr. Meryem with a window behind her, is our new multi-faith college chaplain, herself a Quaker who studied in Istanbul, at Cambridge, in Florence, and at Yale, and she's a history fellow at Oxford. She's interested in the history of silence around genocide, especially in Armenia, which is the subject of the book she's currently completing. She has also made gardens in Turkey and Italy, and she's planning a new herb garden for St Hilda's. Walter Sawyer, who it's easy to identify, is garden consultant for St Hilda's and was for 26 years until 2017 superintendent of university parks. Originally from Newcastle, he studied in York and at the Oxford Botanic Gardens, and he's been a supernumerary fellow of Wolfson College and a member of the SCR at Worcester, and he has an honorary Oxford MA. He's had free rein to redesign the St Hilda's College gardens to beautiful effect. And Dr. Sarah Watkinson is an emeritus fellow in biological sciences at St Hilda's, a specialist in fungal biology and a published poet who was inaugural poet in residence last year at Witham Woods, which involved close contact with badgers and climate change scientists. She's chair of the College Garden Committee, and although she knows a lot about fungi and insects, says she's an enthusiastic amateur about garden plants. A very warm welcome to you all. And we invite you, while those of you who are watching, to enter your questions in the chat line. I shall choose questions from these and from those that have been sent in advance with illustrative photos where applicable, which thanks to Harris behind the scenes will appear on your screens. So perhaps we can begin with one of our questions sent in advance, which is from Lucy Meakin, who is anxious about what to do with winter pots. She says, as someone who spent many happy lockdown hours fussing over my tomato and courgette seedlings and taking great pride when they finally flourished, congratulations, Lucy, I'm rather sad that they're coming to their end. Can the panel suggest anything that I can try to grow in pots to keep me entertained and sane through the winter? That's quite a big ask. I don't have a greenhouse and my little London garden is mostly decked, so I'm growing most things in pots or grow bags. It only gets sun for some parts of the day. So I'm going to ask Serena, have you any thoughts about what you can put in a winter pot after tomatoes and courgettes?
Yes, so I think looking at the very nice photo of your terrace, it looks like you've got some quite big pots, which is fantastic. So I would suggest probably bulbs. You can plant bulbs in the autumn, things like allium, which is actually in the onion family and has these great big pom-pom flowers that come out, look amazing. Snowdrops and bluebells. Lots of bulbs that you can plant in the autumn, and then they'll be, the snowdrops in particular, they'll be one of the first things to flower in the early spring. So you've got something to look forward to. I think this winter is going to be quite challenging for all of us in a number of ways. So that's kind of like a nice optimistic bulb to plant now and to see come out really, really early as February, hopefully. And then the other suggestion I would make is the winter is also the time to plant fruit trees, dormant fruit trees. So you can get dwarf species of little apples and pears. And so if you had a really big pot, you could try doing a dwarf fruit tree and getting some fruit next summer.
That's a lovely combination of ideas. I love that. Fruit
I have
trees and bulbs. Yes, Meryem, what would you like to add to that?
just when you plant the bulbs, you could also plant some pansies on top of them. So you already have some colors while you're waiting for the bulbs to come out. And you don't really have to worry because the bulbs are kind of making their way through the pansies. And that's really neat to see, like flowers coming from flowers. And it kind of
Very
ties
nice.
you over until February, I would say.
That's a very nice idea. I think that, yes, having something, bulbs are always a bit of a problem on their own before they happen because, you know, it's just a waiting game. But pansies on top is a lovely idea. Anything to add, Walter or Sarah, or should we move on? Walter, yes, you look like you've got thoughts.
Yes, there are all kinds of things. Certainly multi-layering your pots are good, and you can have great fun with things. So if you've got a largest pot, you might want to choose some kind of central dot plant. And if you're in London and you're sheltered, you might get away with something like a cordyline, which would give you a bit of form and texture, and then underplant with polyanthus and pansies, and then bulbs, so that you've got a whole range of things. You could think about choosing a nice winter flowering hellebore as a central plant, and that's going to have lovely foliage and it's going to have flowers too. The other thing I thought about this, if you wanted to stick with the vegetable theme, you could think about sowing some broad beans into a pot now, and they will grow during the winter months. If you choose your variety carefully, you don't want one that's going to be too tall, but broad beans are lovely, and they have lovely foliage, so gradually as they develop, that will be good. And when they flower in the spring, they have these lovely black and white flowers, which are scented, and you're kind of keeping your vegetable thing going.
That's a great idea to go with the vegetables if you're already a successful vegetable grower. That's wonderful.
If you dashed out to a garden centre now, you might find some spinach plants, which overwinter all right. And that would be another thing that you could crop early spring. You could think about getting spring cabbage plants. So they would be planted now, and they would be coming on. If you've got pigeons, you're going to have to protect them. Otherwise, the pigeons will love those. But it kind of keeps the vegetable theme going a bit. It's
excellent.
Need quite a lot of attention, but it was just a thought to kind of.
Excellent. Thank you, Walter. That's great. I love the idea of this. I think, Sarah, anything to add, or shall we move on and give you the next question?
I think those are all brilliant suggestions. I can't think of anything better.
But I think that we may have actually gone quite a long way to keep Lucy sane through the winter. Though I can't necessarily speak for the rest of us. We're not sure what kind of winter it's going to be. I'm going to move on to a question from our current audience, if I may. Francis, I just lost that question. It was on my screen. Oh yes, here we are. Francis Shaw says, I have a lovely old grapevine on a south-facing wall, and it's produced masses of grapes, which looked fantastic earlier in the year, but developed mildew over the past month. What did I do wrong? How can I prevent it next year? And what can I do with rotten grapes? Anybody got brilliant suggestions for use for rotten grapes? Sarah, have you ever grown a grapevine?
I have, and it got out of control because I didn't really understand pruning it properly, and it did also develop quite a lot of mildew. But so I think I'd rather pass this quickly on to Walter, who knows more about it than I do.
Yes, Walter, do you have any thoughts about how to stop a grapevine getting mildew?
Well, you didn't get anything wrong, really. Vines are very prone to mildew. What you need to try and do is to keep the vine growing as much as possible. And vines do suffer from drought, and that when they get stressed, they are more susceptible to mildew. So for future years, if there's a long dry spell, it's worth watering them. Pruning them is important. Winter hygiene is very important. So cleaning up all the leaves that come off and disposing of those helps. I mean, it is possible.
Sorry, am I right that you prune in November?
Yes, you should prune between November and about mid-January, because the sap starts to rise very early in vines. And if you're too late in the winter period, when you prune, they bleed a lot, which stresses the vine, which is not particularly good.
Meryem, you've grown Mediterranean gardens. Are you an expert in growing?
Well, I'm an expert in cooking with vine leaves. So I don't know
rotten.
what to do with rotten grapes, but I can definitely send over some very good recipes of stuffed wine leaves. So
Yes.
even
Excellent.
if they're a little bit old now, I mean, usually in Turkey we use the very young ones, but if you don't have the young ones anymore, then you would have to boil your wine leaves, and then you can actually make really nice, like either you can make it with meat or you can do it with rice and with spices. The Greeks do it in a different way. The Armenians are doing it in a different way. So you can, kind of make your way through the Mediterranean with your wine leaves and try the different recipes from the geography. And I mean, they're just really tasty. If you cook them with olive oil, you can keep them in the fridge for a week, and because it takes quite a long time to make those dolmas. So yeah, make enough and enjoy. And if you need a recipe, I can send you the recipe of my auntie's.
That's excellent. So even if your grapes are rotten, dolmas are the answer with your vine leaves. That's a lovely thought. Can we go back to our next question from that was sent in advance, please? Which is their lovely question about what to do to encourage bees and butterflies. Rebecca Walker says, I would like to turn part of my garden over to wildflowers, particularly ones bees and butterflies would like. The soil is currently very compacted and dry. Is there anything I could or should do to it to improve the chances of wildflowers flourishing? And what particular bee and butterfly friendly wildflowers can you recommend? Sarah, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yes, I have some experience of this because I very much enjoy collecting wildflower seeds and then trying to grow them in the garden. And it amazes me how wildflowers are often very grateful to be grown in the garden and turn out to be extremely rewarding once you give them a bit of space and the chance to grow. And they're also experts at growing in difficult places as long as you choose the right sort. So I have a feeling I've been very successful with field scabious, really quite surprisingly so, because it looks rather a delicate plant with a beautiful flower. But seeds from wild scabious have grown very well in my garden and produced something easily as nice as any cultivated plant. And the bees love it. And the other thing that bees really love is wild marjoram, which is very good. It grows on dry places, waste places, tough little herb, Mediterranean sort of thing. And again, I think you'll find that even if the soil is quite compacted and dry, once you get the plants growing, give them a bit of a start, plant them properly and water them in, they'll then take over and look after themselves really well. And you've got a herb there as well, so you can use it. So those are the two I think I'd try, but you could always have a look through the catalogues of some of the firms who sell wildflower seeds, and they often come with recommendations about the kind of place that they'll flourish and also which ones are bee friendly and butterfly friendly. So
that's a nice thought. One of the things that this question asks about the quality of the soil, sounds as though we don't have to worry too much about the quality of soil with wildflowers. I know for our community gardening project, it began with when our local council distributed free wildflower seeds and people began to plant them in the tree pits and just scatter them on the existing rather squatty soil that was around a tree pit. And although it was dry, the next year we had fantastic blooms, particularly of poppies and cornflowers. So I recommend those. I think wildflowers are a good thing for compacted dry soil in my experience. It doesn't hurt too much. But Walter, you planted a whole bed of wildflowers in St Hilda's. So tell us what you recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think compaction's a problem as long as there's reasonable drainage. And there are things that you could sow now, for instance, which would come through the winter all right. Things like linum, which is flax, orlair, which is an umbel, calendula, all of those kind of things, larkspur, nigella, poppies. You could sow all of those things now and they would gently overwinter, or you could wait until the spring and sow them in the spring. Depends, you know, on your site and how you use the space and what kind of grazing creatures you might have. I mean, St Hilda's was pretty good because the soil was light and friable, and you know, we'd done a lot of cultivation there, so it was easy to sow and make look good, really.
Lovely. And for bees and butterflies, my most successful ones have been obviously buddleia, which is not a wildflower for butterflies, but also borage and lavender for bees seem to attract them in vast quantities.
Yeah.
So I recommend those. Any other thoughts from, Serena, tell us about your wildflower successes.
Yeah, I think suggestions I would absolutely concur with. The buddleia one is interesting. It's quite controversial, isn't it? Because it's not a native species and people tend to have very strong views on whether we should only be planting native species. But I think if you see how easily buddleia roots into poor soil in London and many other places I've lived, if you really do feel like it's a compacted poor soil and you're struggling to plant anything else, I can almost guarantee buddleia will thrive.
Yes.
And comes back year after year, and butterflies can get a great meal from it, although they won't necessarily live in it. And then I would say also, I'm a big fan of wildflowers that do things for us as well as things for bees and butterflies. So borage and cornflower that have both already been mentioned, their petals are edible. So you can also freeze them into ice cubes, for example, and they look absolutely beautiful in drinks, or you can sprinkle them on cakes. And so it's just a nice little extra for us, really. So you can plant something which is also good for the kitchen.
Lovely. I love the idea that we're getting the recipes as well as the plant advice here. But this one is the next question, which is from our audience, is about not what to eat, but what to do with the things that we've already eaten. Fairlith Horden wants advice on maintaining a compost bin, particularly for her son and daughter-in-law who've never had a garden. How long will it be before it can be used? And how do you get it to that state? Who thinks of themselves as a compost expert? Walter, I bet you've managed to keep bins in your time.
What are you trying to say?
You look like a man who's been there with compost.
Yeah. Well, compost, there are lots of proprietary compost bins on the market. They all work on various levels. You need to try and feed them with a mixture of things. So, for instance, if you've got a lawn, try and get a mix of things other than grass, because it makes a better compost. I mean, we're moving into the autumn period. Leaves make excellent compost. You should get it within about a year. And the thing to do is to try and have 2 compost bins, and gradually as it fills up, take the material out. It can be a bit of a smelly job, and turn it into the other one, because that aeration process helps the heating. Within a year or so, you should have a usable compost. And it should be dry in the hand. It shouldn't be slimy and horrible and smelly. If it's still at that stage, it's not ready to use yet. So just keep it in the bin, really.
Great. So leaves and grass,
yes.
And food waste, presumably. Aerate it, turn it over, and Bob's your uncle in a year, as long as it's not slimy.
Yeah, you have to be slightly careful with food waste. Certainly, yes. Cooked food waste will attract rats. anything you're stripping off vegetables you buy, that's all compostable stuff. And of course, mix it with any herbaceous things, because we'll all soon be cut on some herbaceous things down. And that
right,
helps.
so better to stick to the cabbage leaves and so on. That's interesting. Serena, you've got compost experience.
Well, I think I've got experience of doing everything wrong with compost heaps. So I've learned from my mistakes that I started making a few years ago. So the first mistake I made was to very carefully build a compost heap under an evergreen tree. So it never really got wet. So it's got to keep moist. So just make sure that the compost keeps moist, whether that's because it's an open heap or because in very dry periods, you need to put water on it, in my experience, to help that process of decomposition. And the other thing I found was it is a bit, I tended to try and put everything into it. So if there were like thin twigs, woody material, you think, oh, that'll be fine, and that is not great if you've got too high a percentage of that material in. And finally, what we found with our quite large compost heap that we've got on our allotment is when it's damp, if you put a tarpaulin over it, it'll keep the moisture in and it will increase the temperature a little bit, which will also help the process of decomposition. It's a bit trial and error. You've got to sort of whip the tarpaulin off, as Walter said, turn it, and then put the tarpaulin back on. But that for us, that speeded up the process of decomposition.
Wonderful, fantastic advice, comprehensive compost advice here from do's and don'ts from both these panel members. Can we go to another question from our previously submitted questions, please? Which is, what is wrong with my mint plant, from Fran Woodcock, who's suffering with black marks all over it. Around half the leaves have it. Should she just give it up, she says, and keep it for its scent and plant a new one for cooking? Or can it be saved? Meryem, are you a mint expert? Tell us about
a little bit, but I think my first advice is to not get too loyal to your herbs. If you really want to have like a plant you can completely focus on, I think I would get an orchid. Otherwise, sometimes the best advice with those herbs in the kitchen, on the kitchen counter, is to just chuck them out. But if you do want to save her, what I have found is that mint really likes company and it likes a lot of space. So this year I have taken my mint that looked kind of like that, and I planted her together with my courgettes. That sounds now maybe really strange, but I planted her with my courgettes in the garden. And since then, she's just all over the place. I mean, she's producing so many mint leaves and sprigs, and I can't really give a scientific explanation except of that she really likes this courgette plant and the really big bed. And I think that's the key with mint plants, that they like to have like a broad kind of bed to grow in.
Lovely. So don't get too loyal to them and give them company and space. That's wonderful. Lovely. Anything to add to that, other than chuck it out and go down to Sainsbury's and buy another one? Which no, we don't want to do. We want to make this plant work.
Yeah, I think those black spots are the winter stage of mint rust, and I would dispose of that plant completely. And start again with a new undiseased plant, because I think when that regrows in the spring, it'll pretty quickly produce the sporum stage again. And Sarah's a better mycologist than I am, but I think that's a heavily infected plant. I would dispose of it.
That's very interesting. Is that a fungus you recognise, Sarah?
Yes, it is indeed, and I would completely agree with Walter, because it doesn't just come year by year. Once a mint plant has got rust, it's systemically forever, so you might as well burn the thing and get rid of it.
Oh, right. Oh, so we really do want to just chuck it, and fine, that's fine. What a shame. But we know what to do with the next one, thanks to Meryem's advice, and how to make that thrive. Thank you. I have another question from the audience, which is particularly for Walter. Joan Dawson wants to know, how do you stop St Hilda's deer from eating your plants? She has a place in Nova Scotia. How nice that you're with us from so far away, if that's where you are now, in the countryside where the deer flourish, and they love her azaleas. What can you do to discourage deer?
Not much, really, only create some kind of physical barrier to keep them out, which is a lot easier said than done. But my experience is that people recommend some plants are not very deer friendly and this kind of thing, but if they're hungry, they'll eat virtually anything, I find. Plant protection is the only thing, really, I think, which might not be an option. I completely recognize that.
But or enjoy the deer, enjoy deer watching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other experience of deer? No, we'll move on, I think, then to the next question that came from the audience. Yes, in advance. Which is, I think, about non-flowering Agapanthus. Yes, Paul Howard has Agapanthus anxiety. He planted some last year, which don't look thriving, but have made some leaves. They only produced one sorry bloom each, he says. Should he leave them well alone and let them establish themselves, or lift and repot them? Should they be in a large pot or given some space? Is the position the issue? They're partly under a walnut tree. Is that perhaps not the best position? Has anybody else ever had an Agapanthus experiences? Yes, Sarah.
I just happen to know that walnut trees are hostile to other plants underneath them. They produce a chemical called juglone, which damages quite a lot of plants. And it could well be that these Agapanthuses are suffering specifically from the walnut. If it's possible to move them, that might be a good idea.
Very interesting. Watch your walnut trees and what you plant under them. Walter, what would make them thrive instead?
Well, I agree with Sarah. Walnuts are renowned for discouraging things from growing underneath them. So I would try and move them. If possible, they want to be in a sunny, sheltered space, very free draining. And hopefully that would kickstart them into producing flowers. You don't need to feed them too much. They flower best when they're searching for food a bit, really.
Lovely. And is one flower per Agapanthus a particularly sorry crop? I have a feeling I have Agapanthuses that tend to only produce one bloom, so perhaps I should have been doing something different too.
Typically out of a big clump, you should get about 20 flowers.
Oops.
But all kinds of things happen. Sometimes mice take the flower buds, for instance, if it's very cold in May, sometimes flowering's interrupted. If it's a frosty spot and you get spring frost, that can be problematic too.
Lovely. Okay, so avoid walnuts and mice and frost. Now, plant identification. Let's play a bit of plant identification game. Can we have the next question that was submitted earlier? Who knows what this is? A mysterious pink flower that keeps appearing in Francis Pigeon's gravelled lavender bed. She's leaving it because it's quite pretty, but will it damage her larger, well-established lavender? Sarah, do you have any thoughts about what this is?
It looks like ground ivy to me. I brought this into cultivation in the garden, and it absolutely took off. It's very, very good at sending out runners. So I think it's pretty, but at the same time, I don't think the lavender is going to enjoy having a huge mat of this stuff around its roots. But still, it's a very nice plant.
Yes, maybe root it out a bit in moderation. Leave some of it to enjoy. Anybody else? Anything to add to that? Or shall we move on to the next identification one, which it may not be the next question. Let's just go to the next one that we've had submitted earlier, which is, oh yes, Amalanche disease. Ming Allsop limbs, Amalanche developed brown and later black edges on its leaves over the summer, even though she watered it very well. What could have caused the leaf discoloring, and is the tree about to die? please advise remedies to bring it back to health. Very important. Amalanche is such a beautiful tree because it does such interesting things in different seasons. Not only those beautifully coloured leaves, but the berries and the white flowers. So yes, what can we do to save it? Serena, have you ever had an Amalanche that you loved?
I'm afraid I absolutely haven't. This is the kind of beautiful ornamental tree that I've got virtually no experience whatsoever. So I'd probably aim that one at Walter.
Yes. Okay, Walter, tell us how to save this lovely tree.
Amalanches do suffer often quite badly in hot summers, and we did have quite a hot spring and early summer. And I suspect they're just a bit sunburned. The key thing to look at is the growing points of the tree. Has it made good extension growth from those terminal shoots? And if it is making good growth, I wouldn't be too worried about this blotching and sunburn. Watering during the summer's good. A lot would depend on location and everything else. So I think unless we could see a bit more and get a bit more, see if the plant's growing well, it's difficult to judge. But I don't think it's fatal.
It's not about to die. That's very good news. Very good news for me. I'm delighted to hear that it's not about to lose it. I lost an Amalanche because I was required to chop it down for being too close to a house, and I had to go away the day it was cut down, not to see the murder of the tree. So I feel with you, anxiety about losing an Amalanche. And the next question, please. Yes. Now this ought to be a question for you, Sarah, because it's about a fungus gnat. How do you get rid of them in indoor plants, says Morwenna Abbott. I've tried drying out the soil, she says, but they keep coming back. It looks rather a worrying thing, this creature. Think about it.
Well, do you know, I really have no idea what to do about fungus gnats coming back. And of course, any insect likes it to be warm and damp to hatch out. And I wondered if you could just maybe create rather drier conditions or put the plant outside for a bit so that the temperature goes down at night, because I think the warmer it is, the more likely you are to get flies and insects all together. So if it's a movable plant, you could try giving it a bit of an airing.
Good idea.
I don't know.
Good idea. Anybody else had infested houseplants? Sounds a rather personal question. Anything that you had experience of getting rid of? Well, okay, we'll try that, Morwenna. Let's say put it outside and hope that these beasts don't come back again. We have another question here. Oh no, we don't. Do send them through. We're waiting for questions from the current audience, but we have others that were sent in advance. So I'm sorry we don't have an absolute answer on the fungus gnats, but perhaps we can identify this plant. Who, hands up, fingers on buzzers, who knows what this is? Anybody care to suggest? I seem to have lost Walter off the... Oh, there he is. Good. Do you know what it is, Walter?
Yes, sorry, my signal dropped out.
Right. Oh, good. I'm glad we got you back.
It's a salvia of some kind. Very definitely a salvia. It might be something like involucrata.
And is it something that spreads a lot? Is it something that grows like a weed? Is it worth leaving? Is it worth cultivating?
Oh, definitely worth cultivating. Lovely thing. Might not be hardy. If it's involucrata in some parts of the country, it definitely wouldn't be hardy. Easy to overwinter either by lifting the plant or just giving it a bit of shelter, putting it in a conservatory or a cool glass house, something like that. But it'll grow outside all of the summer long.
Salvias are lovely things, aren't they? I think particularly that purple, which has become rather the in colour in recent years. I noticed that there's an awful lot of purple about at the Chelsea Flower Show these days. So this is one definitely to be recommended. Another question from our watchers. Georgina Paul wants to know, she says she's thrilled to have received a packet of cornfield annuals from St Hilda's, but doesn't have access to a metre of earth in a garden and isn't sure what to do with them. Can they be used in pots at all? Would you plant wildflowers like cornflowers in a pot? Has anybody ever tried doing that? Yes, Serena.
Yes, so cornfield annuals can definitely be planted in pots. They don't need particularly good soil, as we talked about earlier. They're the kind of wildflowers that, so if you can just gather together some topsoil, you don't need to necessarily use compost. The only thing I would say is that cornfield annuals are typically made up of definitely cornflowers, poppies, usually corn chamomile and possibly corn cockle. So all of these species are quite tall. So all I would say is that when I've planted them in pots in the past, they'll get to a point where they topple over or the wind can flatten them a bit. And that obviously being in a pot makes them that bit more vulnerable to the whole pot going over. So just try and use the biggest pot as you can, and possibly stick in a few canes so that when they do get really tall, you can secure them to the canes with twists, and then they should be absolutely fine. And the cornflowers in particular, I found this summer were absolutely amazing for bees, and they can flower for a really long time.
Lovely, that sounds great. And I gather that this particular seeds are included in your Seeds of Hope, which is why you are an expert.
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. What a nice thing to have, and nice to know that it's something that will grow easily in small spaces, which always helps in a community gardening project, because you can get people involved who don't actually have a garden of their own, but can.
Yep. And sorry, one thing I would add about the cornflowers is that they're really good self-seeders. So it's very easy to gather the seeds from cornflowers and then sow them yourself the next year, save them and sow them yourself. So they're actually really, and the poppies as well to an extent. If you leave the poppy heads to dry out enough, you can harvest both of those. And so in a way, the seeds are very economical because you can save them and not spend any more money next year, just sow the seeds from them.
Lovely. And you can share them with your neighbours, which is also a nice thing to do in the gardening project. Amanda asks, she said, I noticed a lovely tall structural plant, Walter, in the middle of the suffragette border. What is it? And could she easily grow it in her own garden? You had a colour-themed suffragette border, didn't you? Tell us about that.
Yes, we did. Purple and white. So suffragette colours. And this big tall plant is a cardoon, Kainara scolimus, and we've taken the leaves off because they were disintegrating in the wind, and we've left the seed heads. Yes, it's an easy plant to grow. Any good free draining soil, it needs a sunny place. It has really beautiful, very large silvery leaves. If you look up cardoon or artichoke, you'll see it on the web.
And so what does it look like when it's not past the moment? Tell us a little bit more about the cut. Was it white or was it purple, or was it?
It has a purple flower in the centre. I mean, if you go to the greengrocers and you buy a globe artichoke, yes, those seed heads are basically globe artichokes. With a globe artichoke, when you buy them at that stage, they haven't yet flowered, so it produces a kind of purple, almost thistle-like flower in the centre. They're very attractive things. But you need quite a big space, I have to say, for them. You need a good metre all around to be able to grow them.
But what a nice thing to have a suffragette bed in celebration of the history of St Hilda's as a women's college. That's wonderful. The next question that was sent in advance, can we go with that, please? Which I believe is a very specific question about a Cortonista. Anybody ever grown one of those? How to make one thrive. Can we see the image? We've got a bit stuck. Oh, here we are. Lovely. Yes, Charlie Stanbridge wants to know what's the best way to nurture this plant with its tiny yellow flowers, which was found in the garden. What would you do with it? Has anybody ever done anything with this? Is this one of your, Serena, is this kind of flower that you've shared with people?
So it's not something that I've shared, but we do have Cortonista in our very tiny overgrown orchard, and it's growing very successfully up against a stone wall. And so it was already there when we got the place. But I would say if I had found this one, I would probably take the usual steps, which would be choose a sunny spot and dig some really well rotted materials into the ground to give it that, more nutrients, more drainability, and enabling the earth to be kept moist, and then just plant it in a sheltered but sunny spot would be my choice.
Lovely. I'm going to move on because that was such a good answer. Oh yes, sorry, you want to add something? Tell me more.
I think that it's actually a pyracantha and not a Cortonista, and I think what we're looking at are fruits rather than flowers. I mean, all the same things that Serena has just recommended hold good, but I think it'll have white flowers in the spring. And I think if Charlie looks at those orange things now, yellowy orange things, I think you'll find they're berries.
Excellent. Oh, well spotted. Thank you for telling us that. Another question from the audience. Alison Blackburn says, do you have a good way to get rid of periwinkle vinca, or vinca major, without using chemicals? She said she let it grow too much because she liked the flowers, and now it's spread too much. Has anybody, Walter, you'll be the expert, I expect. Anybody else had experience of this? No, Walter, tell us.
Well, it's the very devil when it gets away from you, and it roots down. Any stem that it puts down, it produces roots, and it's how it spreads around. The best way to remove it is to pare it off using a spade. Get down on your hands and knees if you're able to do so, or get someone to do it for you. And get the spade level with the ground and undercut the root system just about an inch below the surface. And that'll cut through certainly all the younger stuff that's spreading around. That'll cut through it and you'll be able to remove it. And if you get just below the central bud level of that developing plant, it won't return.
So is it a plant that you don't really recommend because it's so tenacious, even though it's pretty? It's just describe it to us. It's sort of ground cover, isn't it? With a
yes, it is
bluey, purpley.
That's correct. Yeah, and there are various variegated forms. Sometimes they have variegated leaves, and it's a plant that gets to about a foot tall, 30 centimeters. And it has arching stems which root down as they go, and it's a great ground covering plant, but it's very tenacious when it gets going and can be a problem.
So only use it if you really want to cover the ground.
Yeah.
Lovely. Can we go back to the next of our first questions? And I want to know which of you knows how to make passion bloom. We have somebody with a passion flower that won't flower. This is Siobhan's anxiety. Her passion flower, clematis, which hasn't bloomed. It's on a south-facing balcony. It has plenty of food, TLC, and pleading with it. I'm very surprised that hasn't worked. Has anybody got any thoughts about what? Yes, that looks like the kind of plant you know about. Tell us, Meryem.
Not really, but I have the feeling that you really have given this passion flower a lot of passion and really all of what you can do. And maybe, I mean, this might be kind of a left field idea, but maybe ignore it a little bit and just and don't give it so much passion and so much attention and just let it be, because sometimes, you know, flowers are also like to be just by themselves and be ignored. And I wish you the very best. I think you're a very good host for that flower, but I think maybe too much attention in this case.
Is that your experience, that plants can actually suffer from helicopter parenting?
I definitely have that from my orchids, I have to say. Yes.
Sarah, you do think that's true, that you can overdo it with plants?
I completely agree. I can see this thing looking much happier if ignored for a bit, and especially too much feeding can discourage flowers a bit, can't it? They put all their energies into more greenery.
And I think one of the things that people always do wrong with basil too is that they look at it and they move it around a little bit, and maybe you're doing it with the passion flower too. And sometimes flowers just want to stay put and not be touched or moved around a lot. So that might be, I mean, while you're looking at your flower, maybe you have moved her too much. That could be one of the things that I would definitely not recommend that with a basil plant. I mean, a basil plant should always stay put and not be moved too much. Otherwise, it will go bad. So maybe that's the same thing with this passion flower here.
That's interesting. And that will bring us to our next question. But it's interesting what you say about leaving plants alone, because I know Vita Sackville West said that a garden is always at its best a year after it's been abandoned. But if you do absolutely nothing to it for a year, that's when it's absolutely marvellous. Can we just see the next question, which was, interestingly, about a basil plant that suffered. So you think this has been messed with too much?
Yeah, probably. I mean, you know, basil plants really like to stand next to, next to a window. But like I always say, the basil plant needs a little bit of an open vista or view. This case, I think it just needs to be like that mint plant earlier. I think it just needs to be chucked out. I mean, I'm really sorry for being the messenger of bad news with mint and basil, but this one really looks like it has gone. Really.
Yes, Barbara Lathbury is asking, is there any way she can make it produce more? It's gone rather long and woody. Is that revivable? Does anybody think? No. Oh yes, Serena. You have
well, I think I'm the bearer of semi-bad news. Basil tends to actually like being cut back quite regularly. So you can harvest basil from the top and just leave 2 to 4 leaves still growing, and it will pop back up again. I think what it looks like has happened is that you've left it to grow without cutting it from the top for too long. So it's become, as you say, quite woody. So I think in sad news, this one might not be going to survive, but the good news is that basil is actually really easy to grow from seed. So I know a lot of people would buy it from the supermarket in little pots or from the DIY store in pots, but you can grow it from seed pretty straightforwardly and cheaply.
That's a very useful tip to know. Thank you very much. Grow basil from your seed. So perhaps try that next time, Barbara, and see if it's a bit happier. We also have another question from the audience beforehand, sent to us earlier, which I think is a question for Walter, who does the big architectural things. Maria Woodhouse has, as we see, a lovely, well-established beech hedge, but it's very thin in places, and she has a splendid view through to the neighbour's greenhouse, which the neighbour might mind about. What can she do, if anything, to thicken the growth of the hedge in those areas? Walter, what would you do to make that hedge thicken up?
Well, it's tricky and it takes time. There's no instant answers to this. It might be in those areas where the hedge is thin, worth mulching at the bottom of the hedge during the winter months. That's to say, put a layer of about say 2 inches, 5 centimeters of leaf mold or good compost, added space. During the summer, it might be worth spot watering the bits of the hedge that are thin to try and encourage it. And the other thing to do is, if it does start to produce shoots where there are thin patches, just do some localized trimming with a pair of secateurs rather than a hedge cutter, and just nip out the terminal growths in July, August, and that'll help branching. Because if you're going along with a mechanical hedge trimmer, particularly, sometimes you can take off all kinds of growth that would be beneficial to fill the gaps in due course. But it's going to take a year or two.
Take a year or two. I have a bit of insider information, which is that Maria does entertain deer in her garden. Do you think that might be part of the problem?
Well, there might be a bit of graze on here and there. It's not their favourite thing, but if they're hungry, they'll certainly eat it.
So that's another thing, keeping the deer out, which, as we've discussed earlier, is quite a problem. And can we move on to the next question, which was sent earlier? A question about Abyssinian lilies, again from Ming Alsop Lim, who planted these Abyssinian lilies, Acidanthera murellii, 2 years ago in a well-drained, sheltered spot, and they get the afternoon sun. They've sprouted leaves both years, but never blossomed. How can you make a lily bloom? Anybody have thoughts? My understanding was that you had to leave the roots a bit exposed for these lilies to bloom. I had some that didn't do anything much until the earth sort of washed away from around them, and then they did better. Is that a likely solution, Walter?
Acidanthera's a corm. It's a bulb. And it's related to gladioli, so they need to be planted fairly shallowly. They like lots of sunshine. They are tricky to flower sometimes. If they're in a spot that they like, they will flower extremely well. But finding that spot's not that easy. So it might be that they're planted a bit too deeply actually, and yes. It might be worth, once the tops have died down, just lifting them up and sorting them out and raising their planting height up. Might be worth trying a slightly more open position if you've got one, but they do take a while to get going.
So either move them or lift them a bit.
Yeah,
that there might be hope in that. I have a question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of related to the deer question. And I feel bad because there are several of you who work for organizations that encourage wildlife, but I want to know how to encourage foxes to go away from my garden. I have foxes who dig every year under the shed and have their kittens under my shed. The reason, although they are beautiful creatures, I'm not so fond of them, is that they do dig holes in the lawn. They bring treasures that they found in other bins and scatter them around the garden. It's also not the only thing that they leave that you have to clear up. And I've also seen them with, variously in my neighborhood, guinea pigs, squirrels and chickens in their mouths. So I have slightly mixed feelings about them. Is there anything you can do to discourage foxes? Has anyone ever chased foxes out of their gardens? Yes, Serena.
So yeah, I am one of those people who has worked for various wildlife charities, and including volunteering in a wildlife hospital where we were actually rehabilitating foxes for re-release. So, however, I fully appreciate my dad's got this problem at the moment, digging up the garden and also pooing everywhere. So I fully appreciate it's not ideal when you're trying to harvest your edible crops in particular. And so what I would recommend is a kind of dual approach. So I would just make sure that none of your neighbours are feeding the foxes at their back doors, because that does encourage the foxes just very near to humans and right up to your back doors, and hence more likely into your garden. And also I would just go online and see if you Google something like humane fox repellent spray. There's a couple of brands of a spray that you put around the garden, and it doesn't harm the foxes, but apparently it puts them off coming into your garden, a scent spray.
Lovely. That sounds just the sort of thing. I don't feel too cruel if I just spray something I don't like the smell of. Any other thoughts from anybody about that? What I want to ask you is a more general question. What did your garden mean to you during lockdown? Did it make a big difference to you to have a bit of outdoor space? It's different for Walter because he was working in the outdoors anyway, I imagine. But Meryem, did you have a garden in lockdown, and did it help?
Yeah, I did have a garden, and I'm living next to the river, so it was quite nice in the beginning. When we had the very strict lockdown, I could watch the geese swim by and the swans swim by, so I had a lot of company. And also, I have to say the allotment was really good for me because it gave me kind of a place to be outside and working with the soil. So it was really like for me a sanctuary, I guess. And then now, of course, in the summer, I did so much work in allotment that I didn't have to buy food anymore in the summer because we grew so much. And I think also these kind of socially distanced, but really kind of those unintentional encounters you have at the allotment, just a conversation with a random person that you haven't seen. I think that was really, really was like a blessing for me. But of course, I mean, the gardening here is very different than if I compare it to the gardening that we did in Turkey or in Italy. So I really had to get used to England. And in England, you don't have to water as much because it rains constantly. So I found that as a relief, because in Italy, of course, you have to water 3 times a day. So yeah, I really enjoyed myself.
And did you learn a lot of new plants as a consequence of gardening in England?
I also am the type of person who walks a lot in the countryside, and I have now discovered something that I didn't know, but looks like a fruit that I know from Turkey. It's the blackberries, and in Turkey we have mulberries that grow on the trees, but the mulberries are very sweet. So the first time when I ate a blackberry, I was a little bit like, oops, and that was really interesting. So I think one thing that I'm a little bit surprised of is that people in England don't collect mushrooms as much as I'm used to. And so I was kind of foraging for mushrooms and came home, and then my neighborhood was like, no, you can't eat them, you're going to die, which is a really strange reaction because, I mean, England is actually perfect for mushroom collecting. And I want to kind of ask that to the panel. Why is there such a kind of pushback to collecting mushroom and wild things in England?
Yes, well, because it's caution, because you can kill yourself. I suppose people do feel that they have to be very expert in mushrooms, and obviously there are people who do know enough who are collecting them. Sarah, of course, is a fungus expert, but Serena, we'll come to you in a moment. Serena, do you want to answer?
Yeah, just on the mushroom point, I think it's I've got friends who are from Germany, and they said the same thing. They can't believe that people aren't eating these beautiful mushrooms. I think I've really got into foraging in the last couple of years, and the thing is that unless you're an expert on the mushrooms, the ones that are toxic do look very similar to the ones that are edible, very similar. So there's things like the difference between the gill formation underneath the mushroom. I'm not confident enough to choose between gill formations and think I might die if I, whereas in Scotland here, what we've been doing is foraging a lot of seaweed, because there is no seaweed that is completely toxic in the UK. Yeah. So the absolute worst thing that can happen is it's just a bit indigestible. So that's been lovely. That's been a really nice foraging experience for us.
What about you, Sarah? You're a fungus expert. So do you gather mushrooms? Sorry, you're muted still. Unmute yourself. I think you still are. Just try that again. Or maybe you're frozen.
I'm very confident about, I think, should be okay.
Yes.
So I feel as long as I'm out in the open fields, I'm pretty confident about mushrooms. I think some mushrooms are really worth it. So field mushrooms. I also think giant puffballs can only be mistaken for a child's football, and as soon as you try and cut it open, you realize which one you've got. But I do feel a bit nervous about going into woods because all these fungi, like destroying angels and so on, you can make mistakes, and the penalties for getting it wrong are so absolutely appalling that I rather lack confidence. I go out with friends, and in the Chiltern Beach woods, if somebody shows me something that they can really assure me is okay, I'm happy that there's that black one with the rather daunting name Trompette de Mort, which is absolutely delicious, girole. But I think we're gradually learning. Most people are mushrooming as a child.
You have to be an expert, is our conclusion on that. Do you feel that generally in lockdown we have come to appreciate nature in a new way? We're at a very critical moment about the natural world and our relationship to it generally.
Yes.
Our understanding of climate change and the ecology of the world around us. And do you think that this was timely in a way, because lockdown forced so many people to appreciate being outside, being in the country, being in the garden, looking at nature, and they valued it at a time when they need to recognize its importance?
I really do feel that very strongly. And the first thing I noticed in lockdown was I wanted to buy some lettuce seeds and I wanted to buy some bird feeders. And both of those things sold out online incredibly fast. And I found it a huge delight to grow lettuce that we actually ate lots of, where it was wonderful. And I sent away and even constructed a little cold frame and had a big success. And also we spent a lot of time just sitting there watching blue tits on the bird feeders. So yes, I do feel that. And I feel people have been a bit deprived of nature because natural history no longer happens in schools. It's been written out of primary school curriculums. And I think that there's a move afoot now to reinstate a GCSE in natural history, which I think just might help to pave the way back to natural understanding that people my age were brought up with.
That's yes, I think that's right. That it's not only that it's important and timely now, it's that things actually changed that caused us to lose touch with our understanding of and appreciation of nature. How do you feel about this, Serena? Because you're busy greening up Scotland.
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree. My greatest fear is that we don't learn from this. My greatest fear is that I know that many of us are going into a sort of second phase of semi-lockdown, but I get a bit depressed at the amount of cars I saw back on the road straight after lockdown ended. And some of them are absolutely necessary journeys, but many are not. Going short distances to get things you could get on foot or on a bicycle or whatever. And I just want people to actually, it was a positive thing to be able to look up, and people were saying they could see the stars more clearly, they could hear the bird song, and to roll back into what we were in is something I just absolutely don't think we can go back to business as normal. It'd be absolutely catastrophic. So yeah, I feel very strongly about it. And also, my project was very much about helping people feel less isolated through sowing wildflower seeds, sharing seeds with their communities. And so I feel like I'm passionate about taking that forward in a more normal situation. And hopefully people will kind of start on a slightly different path now.
Well, I hope so, but as you say, it's discouraging that the traffic suddenly shot up as soon as I suppose because people are cautious about taking public transport. So actually, we went from being in a much better position in relation to cars because suddenly the roads were empty, to actually being in a worse position than usual because we all hesitate to take the train. Walter, what's your feeling? Your life has been spent in open spaces. Do you feel that the rest of the world is catching up with you now?
Well, it's quite interesting. We deal with things in a different way now. I mean, when I was training in horticulture, the default position was to immediately reach for some chemical or other to solve your problem. and we've come to the realization that, you know, there are other ways of dealing with things, or, you know, we can live with things that don't necessarily need to be so pristine. And what really fascinates me is our incomplete understanding of the world around us. And we're still, it seems to me, wrestling with how it all fits together. We've got some bits of the jigsaw, but not all of them. And I think we kind of need to live as simply as possible, and we've got to observe how things grow and develop, and how all of that interaction works. And I've had a fascinating lockdown, because we live in the countryside, walking around and looking at the various farming practices and watching what goes on, and reading up about various things. And it's really interesting to me that there are all kinds of things that we don't really understand properly, how things interact together, and how easy it is for us to do something that impacts on something else inadvertently, you know, and we're oblivious to it, really.
Oh, well, what wonderful advice we've had from everybody. A big thank you. I'm sorry we're going to have to round up because we're running out of time here. But I'm very glad to take away from this panel the advice to live simply and observe, to make dolmades, not to be too loyal to herbs, to grow basil from seeds, and not worry if your Amalanche is sunburnt. All these are things that I will be very happy to have in my repertoire of information. I'm also going to leave my screen and scatter some wildflower seeds and plant a waiting choicea. But I also hope to catch the rest of today's Green Gaudy online, and I hope those that are listening will also do so, and that they enjoyed the Gaudy and will have a flourishing weekend. Thank you again to our panel and to our listeners. Bye.
Bye-bye.